Everyone. Welcome to Dyslexia and Literacy, Oral Language Connections to Reading and Writing. I am Joan Mealy McCarthy, and I will be your moderator for the day. I've been working with Will Baker and the Dyslexia Foundation for several years to design these one-day conferences to bring science to practitioners, to truly make this effort a research practice, one for children who struggle with reading and literacy. My daily work is as executive director of the Summit School in Edgewater, Maryland, just outside of Annapolis. And I must tell you that my staff and I benefit all the time from the work of the foundation. I want to welcome educators and parents and sponsor schools. Typically, we would be gathered together in person in a beautiful auditorium, and we would be also live streaming all over the country. But it's a different day and time right now, and we are resilient, so we are all gathered on the grid. But we are very excited to be here and very grateful for MGH Institute to be hosting us with this virtual webinar. I hope that we have on the grid parents of children who struggle with reading, and educators and speech language pathologists, psychologists and social workers, and school administrators and medical practitioners. There is something in this conference from anyone who works with or has any connection to children who struggle with literacy. I'm so honored to see such a diversity of people here gathered just for the sole purpose of helping children. And the fact that you are here says that you understand our job is to do whatever it takes to help children become literate and to take their place in the world. And the need for us to do something is compelling, it's urgent. TDF hopes that today's experience will help each of you help children who struggle academically, even if it's one child at a time. Each year, we cover a topic that's relevant to educators and families and that is cutting edge in nature. We want our participants not only to learn something new, but to begin to think about what they know in an expanded way. That's why we present the neuroscience to set up the day, followed by the strong research that will support the practical application discussed in the afternoon. Today's conference is made possible, as I mentioned, by the Dyslexia Foundation, founded by Will Baker, a very smart, dedicated adult who has dyslexia. He founded this organization to help teachers and families help children learn how to read so they won't struggle in school the way he did. TDF is a nonprofit organization and depends upon member dues and participation in these events. Today, on behalf of Will, I would like to thank Dr. Tiffany Hogan and her research lab manager at MGH Institute, Mary Rasner, for partnering with us and hosting this conference virtually. I also want to recognize Rachel Norton, a graduate student in speech language pathology at MGH Institute, for helping with the administrative efforts for today. And I would also like to thank Lauren Jones, who's the executive assistant at the Southport School, for organizational and administrative support to make this day happen. And finally, I would like to thank our sponsors who partner with the Dyslexia Foundation so that these one-day conferences can be a reality. We have a great day planned for you. Dr. Laurie Cutting will speak about the neurobiological foundations of executive functions and implications for reading and writing. Dr. Vince Collada will talk about the assessment of executive functions. Dr. Ben Powers will talk about lessons learned from COVID-19 and teaching children with learning differences, especially as it relates to executive functions. Dr. Anthony Bashir will talk about oral language and executive functions, and Dr. Bonnie Singer will talk about executive functions and written language. So we have an exciting day set up for you. I would like now to begin the program, and I am going to introduce Dr. Laurie Cutting, who will talk about neurobiological foundations of executive functions and implications for reading and writing. Dr. Cutting is the Patricia and Rhodes Hart Professor of Special Education, Psychology and Human Development, Radiology, and Pediatrics at the Vanderbilt University. She is also Associate Director of the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, a member of the Vanderbilt Brain Institute, and a training faculty for Vanderbilt's Neuroscience PhD program. She's also a senior scientist at Haskins Laboratory. Her work focuses on the cognitive neurosciences of learning, with a particular emphasis on reading disabilities, language, executive functions, and currently she is principal investigator of NIH-funded research projects on reading and reading comprehension, and is co-investigator on other NIH and National Science Foundation projects focused on cognitive development as well as reading and math development and intervention. So let me welcome Dr. Cutting. She's a longtime friend of the foundation, and we're very, very fortunate to have her speaking with us today. Dr. Cutting.
Thank you so much for having me here today, Joan and Tiffany and Lauren and everybody who's partnered with TDF to make this happen. I'm really pleased to be back again and have the opportunity to speak, and was delighted to be asked. Today I'm going to be talking about, as Joan said, the neurobiological foundations of executive functions and its implications for reading. And at this point, if someone could just help me out, I think I'm supposed to put it on slideshow. Is that correct?
Yes, go ahead and put it on the slideshow.
Okay, great. So can everybody see?
No, we can't see it yet. I think you might have to choose your second screen. If you can stop share and do that one more time.
I apologize.
It always takes a few seconds to get the screen up, so no worries.
Did that work?
Let me see. I don't think so. Not on my end.
Well, I just for the audience's sake, I just want you to know that we really actually did practice this. So it's me who's having trouble, but let me try one more thing. I think I remembered what we did last time.
Okay, and no worries, Laurie, if you need to send me something, I can always put it up on my screen too.
Did that work? Because I did what we did at practice.
Maybe start the slideshow and see if that helps.
Oh. Okay. Try one more thing. Of course, it would probably help if I shared my screen.
Yeah, perfect.
That would be the problem. I'm sorry, guys.
No worries.
You know, it's an hour earlier here. What can I say? All right. So hopefully this will work.
Okay, let's see.
Does that work?
Perfect. Yep, you're
Okay. I'm sorry, everybody.
no worries, Laurie. Thank you so much.
You know, I've only been doing Zoom for 7 months, right? And I think I have the hang of it by now. But anyway, well, thank you all for being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak. So as I said, I'm going to be talking to you about the neurobiological foundations of executive function. And just to give you a bit of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the reading process, just so that you have a roadmap of sort of how I think about it and how we frame our studies. And then I'm going to go into looking at predictors of reading and the role of executive function. And I'm going to talk to you about 3 different studies that we've done recently. And then I'm going to talk to you about a very abbreviated study that we did in a very abbreviated way, predicting intervention outcomes. If you have been at TDF conferences before, you will have already heard me present this one, but it kind of ties in nicely with the idea of understanding how reading and executive function play together. So I do want to touch on it a little bit. And then we'll talk about some summary and future directions, and hopefully have some time for questions. So in terms of an overview of reading processes, so why are reading skills important? Probably everybody in this audience has lots of understanding of this, but just to sort of reiterate, literacy skills are associated with lots of different outcomes: educational, employment, economic, health. There's some very interesting studies actually that have looked at the reading levels of doctors' orders that are given to patients, and descriptions of what they're supposed to do, and the reading complexity of those directions, and how many people do actually struggle to comprehend just what they need to be doing for taking care of their health. So, or more simply, as put by Dr. Seuss, the more that you read, the more things you will know, the more that you learn, the more places you will go. And in terms of how our country is doing on reading, well, it's not particularly well. This is the 2017 National Assessment of Educational Progress. There is a newer one in 2019, but it shows about the same statistics. So we haven't changed much over the years, as you can see. And the proficient and advanced, what you see there is that you have 36%. Sorry, I'm still waking up. It's an hour earlier where I am, so I just had to pause for a moment to do that math. 36% of individuals, only 36% score at the proficient or advanced levels, which means that's really where you're supposed to be able to comprehend grade level material. So these are fourth graders. And what that's telling you is that, of course, you have another 63% that are not comprehending where they need to be. So it's a pretty significant issue. And while not all of these individuals have dyslexia, it does have a lot of implications for how we need to be thinking about assessing and instructing individuals across the reading ability spectrum. So how do children get to be real skilled readers, and what can go wrong? So we know many of the characteristics of skilled readers. We know that they recognize words accurately and fluently, both in and out of context, that they have strong vocabularies, they have good verbal working memory, they employ strategies. You know, there's a lot of different things on this list, which means, of course, that there are a lot of different places where something can go wrong. The one thing that I would just want to point out is that, I don't know if actually you can see my pointer here, I'm trying to point right here, that the first bullet point, recognize words accurately and fluently, both in and out of context. That's an important point that I always try to make when I give talks, because it's important, because context can actually facilitate your ability to recognize words and sound out words and say words. And so that's particularly relevant when kids are learning how to read. So if you have a child who has a lot of background knowledge and you know, is able to sort of make inferences from the context of the sentence about words and figure out what they are, they can sort of mask difficulties with reading for quite a long time, because they can use that context to figure out how to sound out a word. And then when they get to a point where they have enough words in a sentence that they don't recognize, suddenly they really start to show problems with reading, but that can often be quite a lot further down the line. Like, you know, maybe when they're, instead of first grade, it shows up in third grade, and then they've got a lot of ground to make up. So that's an important point there in terms of understanding dyslexia. So this is a common developmental framework for reading. It's called the simple view. And of course, reading is anything but simple, but this is a way to sort of conceptualize it. And many studies have focused on the simple view. So basically what the simple view is saying is that you have these two strands. You have a word recognition strand, which is how well you can sound out words on the page, recognize words, not necessarily know what they mean, but just be able to recognize them. And then language comprehension, which is akin to if I read a text to you rather than you reading it to yourself. So it doesn't require word recognition, it just requires you to understand the text. So these two things together, how well you can sound out the words and recognize the words on the page, along with how well you could understand it if you didn't have to be the person who's actually reading it, somebody who's reading it to you. These two things actually have been shown to be very, very strong predictors of total or overall reading comprehension ability, as well as how, as future comprehension ability. So if you measure these two skills in first grade, for example, and then look at somebody's reading in third grade, these two pieces predict quite well how your reading outcomes are going to happen, at least in early grades. Later grades, it gets to be a little more complicated, but for early grades, this is a really robust model. And you'll notice that there's a lot of different things underneath here. So language comprehension, of course, includes a lot more things that are complex, and word recognition also does too. It includes decoding and sight word recognition, as I talked about earlier. And then up here, language comprehension. In order to be able to comprehend a story or a text, you've got to have appropriate background knowledge and vocabulary and so on and so forth. This is the strand that is generally impaired in individuals with dyslexia, although difficulties can arise in either strand or both. Typically, individuals with dyslexia will have difficulties at the word recognition level at least, and oftentimes at both language comprehension and word recognition. So neurobiologically, we also know a lot about which parts of the brain are involved in skilled and impaired reading. So this is a very general model. And what it shows you is that the left hemisphere of the brain is involved in word level processing to a significant degree. And the parts that I really want to focus on are this temporal parietal area in this sage colored Easter egg in the left hemisphere of the brain. And that's thought to be important for mapping orthographic to phonological representations. And then there's this occipital temporal part, which is incredibly important and very robustly shown to be related to word level processing. So individuals who are proficient readers will show a very tight consolidated area of activation here. Individuals who are struggling readers will show less robust activation here. And oftentimes individuals who are struggling readers show activation on the other side of the brain, the right hemisphere, more or more than typically developing readers do. So typically developing readers show this nice predominantly left hemisphere network of activation for word level reading, and impaired readers will show sort of a more diffuse activation that covers both hemispheres. And this is what language generally looks like in the brain. So if we think about going back to that rope slide, the top part of the rope slide, the language comprehension component. And there's a lot of different systems involved. And again, this is also a very simplistic model. But again, it shows more left than right hemisphere activation for language comprehension. And as you can see, there are some areas that are similar to word level processing and some that are more distinct. And so the main point that I just wanted to make is that there's some overlapping systems and some distinct systems. And so this is actual data from one of our studies, which if you've been to prior Dyslexia Foundation meetings, you may have seen me present this study before. I'm not going to go into depth at this point because it's been a number of years since we published it, but in this study, we looked at basically trying to tease apart word level processing and versus reading comprehension altogether. So in this study, we had individuals read science passages and then compared them to words that were scrambled and didn't, come together as a coherent science or, passage that somebody would read. And so the point here that I wanted to make is that you see that when somebody's reading a whole passage versus when they're reading individual words or isolated words, there's a lot of overlaps between the two systems. But this is just overlaying this slide, I'm overlaying the two activation maps. And what I'm showing you here is just that there are, while there are a lot of areas where word recognition and reading comprehension overlap, which is good because you would expect that because you're having to recognize words when you're comprehending text. There are areas that are unique for when you're actually being asked to comprehend what you're reading. You'll notice that there's not that many words that are unique to word recognition, whereas there are some areas that are unique to reading comprehension. And that makes sense because word recognition is a component of having to comprehend what you're reading, but it's not the entire thing. So comprehension involves more than just the word recognition. So now that I've sort of talked to you about those general reading networks and given you kind of a framework of reading, I'm going to move on to the second part of the talk, where I'm going to go over these 3 different studies that focus on the role of executive function in reading. So first off, what is executive function? Executive function is a family of effortful top-down processes when needed, when you have to concentrate and pay attention, when going on automatic or relying on instinct or intuition would be ill-advised, insufficient, or impossible. So there's a lot of different definitions of executive function, but I particularly like this one because it emphasizes that it's a cognitive process where you really need to be effortful and planful and cognizant. So for example, we've all sort of had the experience of wanting to say something and then realizing, oh, that's not a good idea. We need to stop ourselves from saying something. So when you're in that moment, you're inhibiting yourself from saying something, and that's requiring some of your top-down cognitive control processes to tell yourself, like, that's not a good idea. I've assessed the situation and it would probably be better if I didn't say that. So there's a lot of different theoretical models of executive function because of course researchers like to have different theoretical models, but one that's particularly, I think, prominent and helpful for studying reading outlines working memory and cognitive flexibility, which I'm going to define in a second, as central, with inhibition overlapping entirely between the two. So basically, it's these 3 different skills: inhibition, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. So I already just talked about inhibition, about how stopping yourself from talking about something when you realize it's not a good idea. That's an example of inhibition. Working memory is being able to hold things in your mind and manipulate them and sort of being able to do that efficiently enough. So if you think about it within the context of reading, if you read one sentence, you kind of have to keep that sentence in your mind while you read the next one, so that you're able to integrate the meaning of the 2 sentences across each other. So it's this idea that, like, you're kind of like able to hold and manipulate things in your mind. And then cognitive flexibility is your ability to shift from one thing to the next. So one thing that, like an academic example of that might be, if you work with young children, you might have noticed, of course, that when they start doing math problems, they'll have, when you get them to the point where they have to shift between subtraction problems and addition problems and multiplication problems, like in some of those mad minutes that are often part of first grade curriculum, you'll notice that some kids really have trouble shifting from addition to subtraction, for example, and they'll just kind of like do addition, for all the problems. And so there is a situation where somebody's not shifting away from one task to the other. So which parts of the brain support executive function? The primary parts of the brain that support executive function involve a network of different regions of the brain, and it's called the frontoparietal network. And I'm going to be talking about this network a lot, so I'm abbreviating it as FPN, so just take note of that frontoparietal network, FPN. And these are all the areas that are involved in supporting executive function. And by the way, I didn't actually say that, but I'm also going to be referring to executive function as EF. So those are the 2 abbreviations at this point in time in the talk, is EF for executive function and FPN for frontoparietal network. And again, the frontoparietal network is the one that supports these executive function processes. So you might notice, if you'd kept in your working memory the pictures from a few slides ago of the reading of what it takes, what parts of the brain are active during reading comprehension, you may recall that actually some of these areas are overlapping with this frontoparietal network. So the areas of overlap that you see are right here in fuchsia. So it's not all of them. There's certainly quite a lot of areas that are distinct for when you're reading passages. but there's some when you're doing sort of straight executive function tasks, but there is this area of overlap, suggesting that executive function does indeed have some sort of role in the reading comprehension process. So in terms of some predictors of reading, I'm going to go through the first study with you right now, which is focused on the simple view and how executive function how that fits in. So remember, the simple view is this rope slide that I went through with you earlier. And so the question is where does executive function fit in this, this model? So many studies over the years have confirmed the simple view of reading, as I spoke to you earlier about when I introduced that rope slide. However, there's a lot of other reading comprehensions that incorporate reading comprehension theories that have incorporated other processes. So for example, the very famous construction integration model and the reading system framework, both by very well-known researchers, assert that researchers are continuously constructing, integrating multiple sources of information during reading comprehension. So sort of somewhat different than this simple view is this idea that there's sort of this continuous need to be integrating ideas from lots of different places during comprehension, both from the text as well as from your background knowledge. And so many of these are consistent with the idea of the executive function construct, so that making it sort of not necessarily surprising that executive function has indeed been found to be involved with or correlated with reading comprehension. So studies show that executive function, as I just said, contributes to reading comprehension beyond the two simple view parts. And this is a meta-analysis that showed that the effect sizes of executive function on reading comprehension are about 0.36. So, you know, decent effect sizes, and especially thinking about if they're beyond the simple view parts, that contribution of executive function seems to play some sort of role. So it makes some sense that working memory and cognitive flexibility would be linked to reading comprehension. So for example, cognitive flexibility, what I just said before is that this idea that people think you need to be shifting between multiple sources of information during reading, both your background knowledge as well as what your knowledge you're gleaning from the text, and then how these two can integrate to help you learn new information, is all sort of requiring a lot of shifting and cognitive flexibility and working memory, among other things. So in the current study that I'm going to present to you, our goal was to elucidate the relations between cognitive flexibility, working memory, oral language, word level processes, and reading comprehension. So really, very simply, the idea was to look at executive function and the simple view and how these two, how this relates to reading comprehension. So what are the relationships between executive function and word recognition and oral language and reading comprehension? If you look at word recognition and oral language, these two components, those are the ones that make up the simple view, right? And so the question is where does executive function come in? Does it, we know that word recognition and oral language are going to predict reading comprehension, or at least should, by the reams and reams of studies on the simple view. But then the question is does executive function predict reading comprehension through word recognition and decoding? Is that where its emphasis is? Or does it predict through oral language to reading comprehension? Or does it have a direct relationship to reading comprehension? Or does it do all three? Or is it just sort of a very separate entity that is in parallel with the two components of the simple view? So the measures that we use for this study are, we had word recognition and decoding measures to capture the simple view, and we had working memory and cognitive flexibility to capture executive function. We did not use inhibition because, as I think I mentioned to you earlier, inhibition is largely overlapping and encompassed by working memory and cognitive flexibility. So we just had those two measures. And then, of course, a measure of reading comprehension. Down here in the box below, I've showed you some of the details of the measures that we used, the sample that we had. And if you want to see full details of that, this is the reference. This is the study reference. But I wanted to just give you a little snapshot for those of you that are interested. And by the way, there's several times that I'm going to be doing this in this talk where I have these little boxes here below, and that's for people who want to know sort of more the nitty-gritties of the information, that they can look at it there. And then, of course, I have the citations here that you can read in more detail if you want. So the results showed us that word recognition, decoding, and oral language contributed to reading comprehension. So that's good because that showed that the simple view was affirmed by our data, which should be the case. But sometimes actually in research, even the things that should work out don't. But in this case, it did, which is good. And so then the question was, how does executive function play into the simple view in terms of predicting reading comprehension? So here we have working memory and cognitive flexibility, the two executive functions that I talked about. And what we found was that working memory predicted word recognition, while cognitive flexibility predicted oral language. And then when you looked at the entire model in terms of, because this is just part of it, right? This is how does executive function relate to the two pieces of the simple view. Then if you looked at the entire model in terms of prediction of reading comprehension, what we showed was that working memory is related to reading comprehension, but it's through word recognition and decoding. So it's got an indirect relationship to reading comprehension through its exertion on word recognition and decoding. Cognitive flexibility, on the other hand, relates to oral language, relates to reading comprehension through oral language. So its impact is sort of on oral language and then in turn reading comprehension. And I have to tell you that this relationship right here, this cognitive flexibility, oral language, reading comprehension relationship is actually quite robust. We have some longitudinal data that we've been looking at that's unpublished that I'm not presenting today, but it shows that this relationship really withholds over time and is one of sort of the strongest relationships that impacts of executive function on reading comprehension. So sort of interesting thing that I wanted to note, and hopefully next year we'll have more solid results on that, and I can actually present it if I'm presenting at TDF again. So just to summarize, the results from this study showed that we confirmed the simple view, that we found that executive function predicts reading comprehension through word recognition, oral language, and again, slightly differently. We had different executive functions predict word recognition versus oral language, with working memory being more related to word recognition and cognitive flexibility being more related to oral language. So this, just to summarize, I don't think I'll go through the first bullet point because I've talked about that quite a bit, but it just, this study sort of provides some support for executive function potentially being a crucial precursor to skilled reading or playing some sort of role in skilled reading. Those relationships need to be disentangled though. It may be that executive function is a predictor of precursor skilled reading, or there may be some bidirectional relationships where executive function predicts reading comprehension then predicts executive function growth, and so on and so forth. So it's probably a lot more complex than what I presented here, but it does suggest that there's some relationship of executive function to reading comprehension that may be important as we think about it in developmental and longitudinal context. And hopefully understanding more about these relationships would identify some additional targets for intervention programs. Okay, so with this, the idea that we've sort of come up with through all of our various different studies on executive function is this idea that executive function, rather than sort of being a third wheel up here or down here that's predicting equally in the same manner as language comprehension and word recognition, it seems to be suggesting that executive function may be a bit of a behind the scenes kind of entity helping to weave these different skills together over time. A lot more work needs to be done to really piece that apart and truly understand if that is the case. But it provides sort of an interesting rubric for how we might be thinking about executive function in terms of its role in reading and reading comprehension and in reading disabilities. Because of course, if you have struggle with executive function, you may have these pieces, and that may be great. You may be strong in these components, but pulling them all together in a coordinated fashion to execute skilled reading and have them sort of all develop as they should, working together over development may be something that some kids struggle with, because of course a lot of kids do struggle with executive function. So this next study that I'm going to talk to you about goes over the role of executive function in reading fluency. This is a very interesting study done, spearheaded by my doctoral student, Tin Nguyen. And you know what, I didn't actually mention, let me actually mention this before I leave this study that we just finished. This study was spearheaded by two postdoctoral fellows in my lab, Mercedes Spencer and Miranda Richmond. Who done some nice work. Mercedes has a couple of other papers that are already published that are in this same ilk that might be informative for you all to look at. Okay, so now looking at this reading fluency study. So before I dive into the study, first of all, what is reading fluency? There's a whole lot of different definitions for reading fluency. Some people think of it as reading a list of unrelated words accurately and quickly. Other people think of it as reading a paragraph out loud accurately and quickly. And that's often referred to as oral reading fluency, or ORF. Some others still talk about it as reading out loud accurately, quickly, and with appropriate prosody. So having your voice go up and down as it reflecting the components in the passage, such as raising your voice when there's a question mark at the end of the study, the end of a sentence, excuse me. And then there's also controversies about, is reading fluency a predictor of reading comprehension, or does it actually reflect reading comprehension? So it's sort of a messy construct that a lot of people talk about, but I wanted to be a little bit more explicit about the different definitions because of the fact that it is a bit variable in terms of how people think about it. But the definition that we're focusing on today is reading a paragraph out loud accurately and quickly. So that's the piece that's going to be relevant to the study that I'm showing you. Now, the question is that even though it's a little bit confusing and there's sort of different definitions of reading fluency, why do we actually care about it? Well, we care about it because oral reading fluency, again, that's how accurately and quickly you can read a paragraph out loud or connected text. Oral reading fluency is highly correlated with reading comprehension and overall reading ability. So you can see these are just some sample correlations of oral reading fluency's correlation with reading comprehension. So it's a good temperature read of a child's reading ability. And so the way that I like to think about this is that you have a child who may have a temperature. So this child clearly has a temperature here, right? And so it gives you, this is clearly an abnormal temperature reading. And so if ORF, the analogous thing for ORF would be a very slow and inaccurate reader, right? But the thing is that you know that, and you know that they have some sort of problem, just as you do if somebody has a fever, but you don't know exactly why they may be having that problem. And so it gives you just a good sort of overall quick temperature read of, okay, there's something going on with this child's reading ability and we need to investigate it further. So in this study, we wanted to sort of pick apart the role of different parts of reading fluency and see whether we could understand more about what was actually going on during reading fluency, and if it could tell us something helpful about children's reading abilities beyond this temperature reading indicator. So what we did in the current study is we examined the roles of miscues and self-corrections in ORF. So what I mean by miscues is individuals, when they're reading out loud, saying the wrong word, leaving out a word, or substituting a word, something like that, okay? So those types of errors. Self-corrections are when readers correct their mistakes. So if they say the wrong word, for example, then they go back and they correct it. And so the thought behind this is that there's maybe something different about individuals who are actually able to go back and self-correct versus those who keep reading. And that might be informative for understanding what is comprised of oral reading fluency. And so one of the things about self-corrections that people have talked about is that it may, in addition to just being a different metric than miscues, some people have attributed it to this idea that it helps you build a representation, that it is a reflection of how well you're building a representation of the text when you're reading it. So in fancy terms, reading comprehension theories call this a situation model, but the idea is sort of this mental model that you have of text. And so if you have this mental model and you're constructing this mental model and you make a mistake when you're reading out loud, if you correct it, that may be suggesting that you're understanding sort of this global representation of text. You're realizing, uh-oh, this doesn't fit in, and so I'm going to correct it. And so this is just an example of one of the stories that, or one of the passages that children had to read in the current study. And so we hypothesized, in terms of what is the role of executive function in miscues, we hypothesized that worse executive function would be related to a higher number of miscues. So you're not really keeping track of what you're reading, right? And so you're just kind of plow on when you make a mistake. But then we thought that if a reader's ability to self-correct was sort of reflecting this idea that you're realizing, uh-oh, there's something that doesn't fit in here and I need to go back and correct it, that better executive function would be related to more self-corrections. So the idea that one had made an error and that it needs to be corrected, that might be reflective of somebody having better executive function, or might be facilitated by having better executive function. And so in this study, we had 82 children that were around 7 years old. They had a range of reading ability, and we measured lots of different things to do with their reading outcomes. Of course, all the usual suspects. We measured the simple view components, word recognition and oral language. We also measured their executive function. And then this was the measure that we used for reading fluency, which was from the qualitative reading inventory. And we used words correct per minute, so how fast and accurately they were able to read these passages. And so in a nutshell, what we found was that greater number of miscues were predicted by, not surprisingly, basic reading and language, so the simple view component. So basically sort of like how well you're able to kind of read in general, your general reading ability was predicted by, predicted the number of miscues. So you had worse reading and worse language predicted more chance of making a miscue. And then the worse executive function you had, that also was coupled with making more mistakes when you read a passage. However, in contrast to these two, in contrast to those findings, the ability to self-correct the mistakes that that individuals made or readers made, was predicted by better executive function skills. So these were sort of above and beyond what you would expect, you know, in terms of somebody's reading abilities and so on and so forth. Those probably would play into how well you were able to self-correct or how many miscues you made. But, you know, above and beyond that, these two different classes, self-correcting versus miscues, seem to have very opposite relationships with executive function, with better executive function related to more chance, more probability that you would self-correct a mistake, whereas worse executive function was related to more of a probability that you would make a mistake and not correct it. So in terms of conclusions and implications, more miscues were associated with worse executive function, as I just said, and then whereas the self-correction is linked with better executive function. And so the idea that we were thinking is that these self-corrections may reflect parallel recruitment of domain-specific and domain-general processes. So by that I mean reading and language processes, those are domain-specific, and executive function, which is considered more of a domain-general process, so sort of something that can impact a lot of different areas. But that those are both kind of needed and recruited at the same time to resolve miscues, which is an idea that's been proposed before in sort of theoretical papers. And so it does support this idea that self-corrections may reflect a higher level comprehension processing, like monitoring what you're reading and the mistakes by it. And so this further supports executive function's role in reading development. So the third study that I'm going to talk to you about is a neuroimaging study. And before I get into that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I just showed you that executive function has this role in predicting reading comprehension. This is a study that we did quite a long time ago, but it shows you in a more simplistic way that executive function is just showing you that executive function predicts reading comprehension in addition to the simple view, which we picked apart a little bit more in that first study that I showed you in terms of how it predicts. But the important point that I wanted to make here is that this prior study that we did a number of years ago also showed that not all text place the same cognitive demands on the reader. And what I mean by that is that when you split reading comprehension into two different types of texts, reading stories or informational text, which is referred to sometimes as narrative text or stories, and expository text or informational text like science textbooks, for example. It's generally accepted that narrative text is easier to read than expository text. And a number of studies have shown that genre influences reading comprehension, with narrative text being easier to read and better understood than expository text. So why is this important? Well, it's important because expository text is one of the primary ways that individuals learn new material. And so it becomes very important, particularly as children get older and older, that they're able to learn new information from text. And so what this study showed a number of years ago is that it showed that if you split reading comprehension outcomes into narrative reading comprehension versus expository reading comprehension, so having to read stories versus having to understand the material, I'm sorry, not understand the material, having to read material where it's more informationally oriented, that this expository text requires, has greater demands on executive function. And just to note that these findings actually can't be explained by narrative text, can't be wholly explained by the fact that narrative text is just sort of easier text. In some ways, actually, in some studies, actually, if you just look at the text characteristics, like how long are the sentences, or how frequent are the words and things like that, you'll sometimes see that expository text actually has text properties that would seem like it would be easier to read, not harder to read. But it has these sort of greater executive function demands. So anyway, just sort of stepping back from all the nitty-gritties of that, the idea is that narrative and expository text may have some unique properties to them. And so this led us to ask the question, are there neurobiological differences for narrative versus expository text? And so one of the things that you could think about when you're focusing on this question is why is expository text comprehension different from narrative text comprehension, and what are these differences? One thought could be is that expository text is just harder. So, and if that's the case, it would involve similar neural processes as narrative text, but maybe just increased activation. And if so, that the implication for that is that expository text should just sort of be treated as hard narrative text. Or it could be that there's some unique cognition involved in it. So it could be that expository text involves different neural processes than narrative text. And if that's the case, then narrative should also have some unique neural processes from expository text. And so this would suggest that narrative versus expository text, or different genres of text, may have different developmental timelines and impact different reader groups in different ways. And so our hypotheses in the study were that narrative text may involve more of what's called the default mode network, which is important for social cognition and theory of mind. So the idea is that this default mode network is sort of allows you, is engaged when you're involved in sort of socio-emotional processes and theory of mind. For those of you who may not know what that is, it's the idea that you can sort of walk in somebody else's shoes. So you can sort of think about what is somebody else thinking about and what is their viewpoint. So again, sort of a social, emotional kind of process. Expository text, we hypothesized that it would involve more of the FPN, so more of this frontoparietal control network that supports executive function. And as we've already talked about, frontoparietal network involves working memory, goal-directed thought, cognitive flexibility, those types of processes that we've been talking about as being executive function processes. And so in the current study, we had 45 children in the study that were 8 to 10 years old, and they read both stories or narrative text and informational text or expository text in an MRI scanner. We matched the narrative and expository text on measures of difficulty. And again, these are sort of some more of the nitty-gritties of the study. If anybody is interested and would like to see it, this is the reference for it right here. There's a lot of different pieces of the design, but in a nutshell, that's what we did with them. And I think in the interest of time, I'm actually going to skip this actual description of what they saw in the scanner and go right into the results. And what the results were, not surprisingly, of course, when individuals were reading expository text and narrative versus narrative text, which you can see denoted in red versus blue. What you see is that and then where they overlap. There's an awful lot of overlap in this fuchsia color. So that's where when people are reading stories and when people are reading, in this case, they were reading science texts. When you're reading stories and science texts, they're both commonly using many similar areas, many overlapping areas of the brain. But then you also notice that narrative text, which is the blue, represented by the blue, is showing more neural activation in some areas, whereas expository text is showing more activation in other areas. And these coincide actually with the differences in the frontal parietal network and this default mode network, which is the social cognition network. And so what you're seeing here, this has got a lot of sort of complicated figures here, but basically the take-home difference between the two is that expository text involves more activation of this executive function of frontal parietal FPN network, whereas narrative text involves more activation of this social cognition network. which makes sense because narrative text or stories, they have characters that you can perhaps identify with as you're going through the text and reading. And so it may be, we have some hypotheses about why it may be that narrative text narrative text is easier than expository text based on some of these brain pattern findings. I'm going to skip that slide for right now. So what is the frontoparietal network doing in expository text, and how does that coincide with what is going on in narrative text? So basically, we first of all, it seems more like this hypothesis of unique cognition was supported, and that's because first of all, the texts were equated on a lot of the measures you would think might make them different, such as how frequent the words are, how long the sentences are, and so on and so forth. But more importantly, we found that expository text had greater activation than narrative text in certain areas, predominantly frontoparietal network. And narrative text also had more activation than expository text, but this was in a different network. This was in sort of the more social process network. So the thought is that is executive function involved because expository is more goal-directed? Does it require more planning, organization, cognitive flexibility, and working memory than narrative text? And is the default mode network more involved in narrative because it involves more socio-emotional processes, like I mentioned before, sort of identifying with characters? One of the open questions is this all due to differences in integration of new with prior information, or integration of a reader's background knowledge into their in new knowledge with their background knowledge? And this has a lot of implication for reading instructions and a lot of different directions that we need to keep exploring to understand this better. Okay. So as I promised that I was going to go through very quickly this last study, which if you have been to a prior Dyslexia Foundation conference or another talk of mine, you may have seen this before. But the idea with this one is we wanted to predict intervention outcomes using neurobiological indices. So in this study, what we wanted to do was we wanted to take what individuals' brains looked like before they received intervention and ask the question for people who ended up responding to intervention versus those who didn't. What were some of the differences in their brains? And so as I talked to you before, showed you before, this is a model of what word level processing looks like in the brain. And actually, let me just clarify one thing. This intervention study that I'm going to talk to you about, we're shifting here, requiring some cognitive flexibility. I'm asking you to shift. We're shifting away from reading comprehension and going back to word level processes. So this intervention study that I'm talking to you about is just in terms of trying to boost readers' word level processes. So just to remind you, this is the model of what the brain looks like in terms of when you're having to process and recognize individual words, not necessarily comprehend them, but just when you see the word, what areas of the brain are getting active. And so what prior studies have shown is that the brain actually changes as reading gets better. So if you do reading intervention with individuals, their brain actually becomes more and more, ends up looking more and more and more. The better reader they become, the more and more their brain activation patterns that look like typically developing readers. So an individual who's struggling with reading might have a lot more right hemisphere activation, for example. They receive good reading intervention, and then their patterns of activation may show up to be much more like this. So more activation on the left side in these two, particularly, in these two areas that are related to word recognition. But studies, as I mentioned before, they suggest that some studies have suggested that the brains of those who respond versus those who don't may have neurobiological differences before intervention. that can predict responsiveness to it. And that's important because we can have sort of the same people at the same level of reading skill that start off. So you might have, say, a cluster of maybe 10 kids that are struggling with reading, and they all show about the same level of reading. But some of them will end up responding to reading instruction and others won't. And understanding the predictors of those, you know, we understand some of the predictors of those, but we still need a lot more fine-grained understanding of how we can predict before we even start reading intervention and investing, you know, all that time and energy into helping kids. Is there a way that we can kind of identify, like, okay, this group of kids, even though they look the same as that group of kids, they have the same reading skills, same kind of profiles. But if we could identify before they even start intervention that this group of kids is probably not going to respond to this type of intervention, whereas this group of kids will, or understanding more of the characteristics of people, of readers who do respond to intervention. So that's what this study was all about, that I'm going to show you. And in a nutshell, again, another complicated slide, there's sort of a simple point that I wanted to make to this, which is that in this study, what we found is that for readers who went on to respond to intervention versus those who didn't, what we found was that the frontoparietal network was involved in sort of helping in the most sort of simplistic sense. This is a little bit of correlation, you know. I do want to sort of put this disclaimer that this is all based on correlation. So of course we have issues in correlation, not equally in causality, but sort of putting that aside, the idea in a nutshell behind what we found was that for individuals who are struggling with word level reading, when we took a group with them that all had about the same reading levels when they started. We gave them word level intervention, focusing sort of on a Orton-Gillingham based approach. And then we looked at people who responded versus didn't, and what they looked like before they ever started intervention. And what we found is that the individuals who were able to respond to intervention had this involvement of the executive function systems, the frontoparietal systems. And in particular, what the frontoparietal system seemed to be doing was helping to facilitate coordination between some of these areas that we know are important for reading. Okay, so in this left hemisphere reading network, we have people, the frontoparietal network seems to be helping to coordinate between different areas that we know are important for reading. And then there was also some coordination across the brain, in particular to some areas that we know are sort of linked to responsiveness to intervention. So basically the idea is that, you know, executive function systems may be coming in sort of, again, behind the scenes, a little bit like our first study that I talked to you about with the simple view, maybe coming in behind the scenes and sort of helping these important language areas coordinate with each other, which then may facilitate responsiveness to intervention. So I think I've actually said most of this before, but one thing that I do want to point out, I know we're getting very close to the time that I need to close, but it seems that the frontoparietal network may play some sort of facilitatory role in individuals who are able to respond to intervention. This is denoted by DysR, so dyslexia responders. And this is actually consistent with studies in other disorders and brings up this idea that's been proposed sort of that the FPN could be an immune system of the mind. And what I mean by that is that executive function involvement across disorders has led to the suggestion that this frontoparietal network could help regulate other more primary neural systems in a goal-directed manner. And this could happen in both typical and pathological states. And therefore, that may mean that individuals with worse clinical outcomes, in this case, we're talking about reading, may reflect both a primary disease-specific neural deficit, so we could think about some of those left hemisphere areas that I talked about, that are primarily involved in reading. But it also may reflect a failure, a secondary failure of the frontal parietal network to kind of come in and rescue or direct some of those more vulnerable systems. And so this may suggest that people who respond to intervention have this more intact kind of behind the scenes executive function support than non-responders. All right, so I'm almost finished. I know I'm just about out of time, or am out of time, but I only have like 1 more minute of stuff. So executive function appears to be involved in multiple ways in reading development. It's linked to both word level and comprehension level processes. It appears to be linked to intervention response. It has this sort of complex relationship that we're working on teasing apart to in expository versus narrative text. And some of these insights may eventually allow us to know who is going to respond long before starting a certain intervention approach, and may help us sort of figure out how do we tackle this complex task of teaching narrative versus expository reading comprehension. And so our current and future directions are, we're really focusing in on trying to understand not just how differences between narrative and expository text or different types of text characteristics, not just like, are they different, but what's happening while people are reading? How does this sort of like online processes of reading, do we have clues about why certain things are easier or harder in terms of text construction and the way the different text features, including whether it's a narrative text or expository text, like how do people form, situation models or mental models of what they're reading? And how can that inform us to understand why there's eventually reading comprehension success or failure from individuals? We're also still focusing a lot on the characteristics of responders and non-responders. We have an ongoing study right now on that and how the neurobiological correlates of executive function may relate to academic growth. And also it's the role of the frontal parietal network in resilience, both resilience in terms of intervention response, as well as resilience in terms of, we have some other studies focusing on individuals who come from lower socioeconomic status and how the frontal parietal network may come in and help with resilience in multiple different ways. And then finally, we're just beginning to kind of explore how to bolster executive function skills that transfer. I had that on my slide a second ago, but don't have time to go into it. But the idea is that people might think, well, you could just go in and train executive function skills and maybe that would help a lot of things. And so far that hasn't shown to be particularly effective, but it's still an area of under a lot of exploration in terms of, are there ways to bolster executive function skills? And so far it seems that we need to really be focusing on how to bolster executive function skills while we're teaching the specific domain that we're interested in. So while we're teaching reading or while we're teaching math, because it doesn't seem that just teaching executive function out of the context of reading or math is transferring to improvement in reading or math. And so I'm going to close with thanking, acknowledging, first of all, the funders and supporters of our work, including the Dyslexia Foundation, for which I've been involved with for a long time and always have wonderful intellectual discussions and thoughts that come out of meetings that we have. So very appreciative to them, as well as the individuals that provide, the entities that provide funding for the work that we do. And those are the grants in bold are the ongoing grants that we have in our lab that are actively going on. And of course, thank you to all the students and many collaborators. I mentioned some of them. I think I forgot to actually mention that in that reading intervention study, the two of my students were key and co-first authors on that, Laura Barquero and Catherine Aboud, really spearheaded that work. And Catherine Aboud also spearheaded the work on comparing the neural correlates of expository and narrative text. And so with that, I'm going to end. I apologize. I know I'm a few minutes late, but I know we had a little bit of trouble getting my slides to work. I should say I had some trouble. Okay, so with that, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cutting, for a fascinating talk. We do have several questions. I do want to ask one, and we will stay on schedule. So the next speaker will start in 10 minutes. So if anyone wants to take a break now, feel free to, but I just want to ask one quick question. I believe you answered it, but it has several upvotes, so I want to make sure I ask it directly.
Okay.
The question is, based on your findings, would you recommend direct intervention work on those executive function skills, or should they be incorporated within more reading-focused interventions?
Yeah, so right now, like I said, I think there's still quite a lot of exploration that needs to be done in this area, but right now the studies on directly training executive function, like directly training working memory, for example, have shown that training does not transfer to improved reading or math. So there's been several meta-analyses and that have tried to look at this issue and whether this training transfers to reading or math skills, and those show that they do not. There is other work that's going on to try to parse that a little bit more, but at this point, in terms of what would be the best clinical practice and supported by research, I would say that it would not be supported by research to try to directly train executive function skills, that your resources would be much better put into directly trying to work on reading and math. And a lot of those intervention programs have components that are more executive function based. And so that may result in executive function improvements. And in fact, there are some studies that show that reading comprehension interventions in and of themselves result in executive function improvements. Or reading, let's see, I'm not sure it's reading comprehension interventions. I may be wrong about that. It may be reading development, but the idea that there may be sort of a bidirectional relationship, that if you're improving your reading, you may also be improving your executive function and vice versa.
Okay, that makes good sense. Thank you so much, Dr. Cutting.